Hi, Crain. My name is Citie. I will present you, but in Spanish because most of the people here speak only Spanish. En este momento, chicos, tengan todos primero buenos días. Voy a presentar al expositor del día de hoy, que es Crain Soudiem. Él ha estudiado y trabaja en la Universidad de Cape Town. Actualmente es vice-chancellor justamente en esa universidad. Trabaja en el área de educación. Ha trabajado con en muchos comités de revisión y lectura de documentos en el tema de justamente que trabaja. Él nos va a presentar la ponencia Teaching and Learning from New Futures, Innovate, PWD, Personalized Learning and Social Justice. So, Craig, you can start now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are you going to manage the presentation from your side, or will I do it here?
No, you can do it there.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to simply make an adjustment to my screen here, if you don't mind, colleagues.
Share. Okay, inside this window. Now, just now, and then put it's on. That's right. So put it on full screen.
We can see your presentation now.
Okay. Just close this, reduce that, yeah. Just, there's your full screen. Oh, I don't know why it's not doing it.
Yeah, my apologies, colleagues. I'm having difficulty in switching the screen to full screen mode.
Just try again. Just go with that. There we
go.
Oh,
great. Yeah, no, thank you very much, colleagues. Thank you for inviting me to be here with you this morning. And my apologies for not being able to speak to you in Spanish. I hope that my English is comprehensible and that you will be able to follow what I am doing. So thank you very much again. So this is what I'm going to do in the talk, colleagues. I'm going to begin by making some comments about the aim of education. I will then move on to speak about the dominant ways in which we manage education in the world today, and then talk about innovation. What I'm going to be talking about innovation here is essentially to emphasize the importance of individualized learning as the bedrock on which innovation should be mounted. And I'm going to be talking here about the debates that we have around nature and nurture, and then take two examples of innovative pedagogy that I think addresses this question of innovation. And I lastly try and bring innovation and social justice together as the major point which I would like to leave with you. So what are the aims of education? The debate about a good education remains open, as it should. We should be debating this question all the time. In terms of contemporary educational theories, classic approaches pivot, rest on the idea that the aim of an educational system is to improve man. Education's task is to impart the knowledge of eternal truth. But progressive approaches to education, marked by the work of John Dewey, is that education must increase the ability of the child to direct the course of his or her subsequent life experience. So the ability to solve problems here for the child is the aim that I am emphasizing. Essentialist approaches, and this is what we have in many parts of the world, privileged knowledge content. In those approaches, the teacher is central. But the World Economic Forum is telling us that education models must adapt to equip children with the skills to create a more inclusive, cohesive, and productive world. And in this organization, controversial as it may be in some settings, is the recognition that the child has to be the center of our educational attempts. So building on that, my own approach is straightforward. I would like to argue that our work of education to be good is a question of how we prepare our children to construct and reconstruct endlessly the imagination, the realm of possibility in which they come to explain themselves, and the grounds on which they stand in relation to any question of public good. They must be able to explain that. If a child is going to be able to hold his or her own in the world, that child needs to be able to explain the story of his own, her own becoming and his or her own place in the world. But there's a paradox here. And this paradox is that most understandings of education have this child at the center. So this is what you will hear in the language, in the rhetoric, in the policy of most educational systems. But I'd like to make a provocation here. And this provocation is that this child that we talk about in our educational policy has to learn how to live in community, how to be him or herself in the presence of others. And despite what our educational commitments say, we have difficulty in dealing with making this child an individual, but at the same time a member of his or her community. And the problem is essentially that most educational systems rely heavily on passive forms of learning, focused on direct instruction and memorization, rather than interactive methods that promote the critical and individual thinking needed in today's innovation-driven economy. Now, I cannot emphasize how strong this dominance of passive learning is in most parts of the world. So, of course, in privileged settings, children have the opportunity and have access to be able to take responsibility for their learning. But in most parts of the world, we have teacher-led, teacher-dominated forms of education. And so here's the importance about innovative pedagogy. It is recognized that innovative teaching methods are better able to prepare learners to meet global demands. Educational systems around the world are thus moving away from traditional methods to more modern ones. This is beneficial for both learners and educators. Conventional methods lend themselves to rote learning. And so what is innovative pedagogy? Innovative pedagogy is pedagogy which facilitates learning and which enables the child to be able to engage the conditions in which he or she finds themselves and brings blind spots, biases, and other social, environmental, structural, and cognitive barriers to the surface. And this is the point that I want to make about socially just innovation. Socially just innovation is about, on the one hand, identifying the barriers that stand in the way of learners or disadvantaged in any way, from the structural to the personal. So I'm talking about things like race, class, gender here, but also personal abilities, or what we might talk about disabilities, But it is also important, and this is a really crucial point for me to be making, we need to be responsive to children who are learning in exceptional kinds of ways. Learners who want to learn more, who learn more easily by themselves. Learners who wish to extend themselves. So this innovation and justice is not only about disadvantage, it is also about accelerating those who have ability which is beyond what we would expect of a normal child. So good fundamental education is a fundamental human right, but it must also be inclusive. A broad definition of inclusive education seeks to, therefore, transform education systems and environments towards welcoming and responding to all forms of difference and diversity. And I cannot emphasize this enough. When I talk about difference and diversity here, I am talking about, yes, those social differences which are familiar to us, but also differences which we have not yet identified, such as children with extreme giftedness, extreme forms of capacity in special areas of their lives. When we ignore those children in favor of what we call normal children, we are not being just to the diversity of children in front of us. So, as I've said, inclusive education correctly focuses on race, class, gender, language, and disabilities. It must, however, also include learners with advanced learning needs. It must therefore be aware of the social attributes that produce different forms of difference, but also that but also recognize the personal attributes that learners bring to the experience of learning. And this is where our challenge is. How do we develop learning pathways for children that are sensitive to the individual qualities that a learner has in his or her development, and pathways that are agile, ready to adjust to the individual child's needs and the needs of the wider social groups to which individuals belong. And so these are important forms of innovation which we have to be aware of and which we have now access to. And I'll just go through these forms of innovation very quickly. I won't be repeating what is on each slide. I'm quite happy for all of you to have access to these slides afterwards, if you so wish. But these are important forms of innovation which we are beginning to use. We begin with MOOCs, massive open social learning platforms. These are platforms which engage people in these online facilities right now, for short periods of time around particular areas of problem solving. And they are extremely useful in being made fit for the purpose of particular circumstances of particular situations, and they are now widely available. We can find MOOCs now on virtually any subject that we might be interested in. We also have what we call flipped classrooms, and flipped classrooms are a really important innovation which they're not based in these conventional settings which all of us have been socialized and grown up in. They attempt to move into the learner's own space. And that's a really important development which we saw partly being realized in the COVID era. We saw in the COVID era teachers having to come to learn about the circumstances individual children, and particularly through remote learning platforms, go and enter the circumstances in which a child is learning with his or her parents, with peers, learning by him or herself, and so on. So these flipped classrooms are really important developments. Alongside a flipped classroom, we now also have dynamic assessments, in which we are using assessment to come to understand in real tailored ways, real individual ways, where an individual child is in his or her learning. And you'll hear me coming to talk a little later on about the example of what I call learning at the right level. And so what dynamic assessment allows us to do, and our technological resources here now are really important in helping us come to this. We can establish fairly authoritatively where most children are in our classrooms in terms of their learning, beyond standardized tests. What standardized tests do is measure a child in relation to what we understand to be the standard levels which a child ought to attain. But dynamic assessment is focused on that child. What is it that that child can do? Event-based learning is also important. It's creating what I call public pedagogic opportunities, where we take events, where we take issues such as climate change, for example, and we come to make the issue of climate change a public issue around which a process of learning can be explored. And it can be interactive, it can be out on the streets, it can be in these digital forms. It can take place around play groups, play circles, reading groups. It can be used in many kinds of ways. Bricolage, of course, is learning through play and experimentation, and it's an old methodology which teachers, of course, continue to use in foundation phase learning, but which we have tended to abandon in favor of when learning becomes more intense, rote forms of learning. Crossover learning is informal learning, which includes learning outside the classroom, where we particularly take children out into encounters with their natural environment, and we teach them on site about the plants that they're looking at, the biological life cycles of the ecology in which they find themselves, and so on. Computational learning is what very much what we are doing now, but in the way in which I am talking to you, to use a set of technological facilities to be able to hold complicated ideas in place. Storytelling is what we regularly do, and I won't say anything about storytelling, but storytelling is a critical part of how learning happens in many parts of the world, both formally and informally. Technological learning is using all kinds of devices to facilitate learning. And the last one to talk about here is learning to learn. Now, I'm not going to make very much about this, but I'm going to say that it is implicit in everything that I'm talking to you about. It's essentially about executive functioning. Now, executive functioning as all of you know, is that process which through which a child is able to undertake and execute complicated mental exercises, memorizing, synthesizing, analyzing, and so on. The point that I'm making here is the urgency of teaching this skill as an active capacity which children need to know about themselves. They need to know, and this is the innovation which comes out of this, they need to have a sense of how their learning is taking place in their heads. And it's to that that I would like to turn tangentially almost, but and hope that there's opportunity in the future to talk about this. So we have now come to learn a lot about how our brains work. And particularly from about the year 2000, we have come to learn a great deal about how the learning brain is in operation in our processes of learning. And the key thing about this is that we now have studies which demonstrate and show us through neuroscience what happens when in a child's brain when learning is underway. Each of our brains is primarily composed of about 85 billion neurons, which is more than the number of stars you can see with the naked eye in the night sky. So these neurons fire. They act as messengers, sending information in the form of nerve impulses to other neurons. So, for example, when you're writing, some neurons in your brain send the move fingers message to other neurons. Move your fingers. And then this message then travels through the nerves like cables all the way to your fingers. The electrical signals that are communicated from one neuron to another are therefore what allows you to do everything you do: write, think, see, jump, talk, compute, and so on. So each neuron can be connected with up to 10,000 other neurons, leading to a large number of connections in your brain, which looks like a very dense spider web. And so right now, your brain is pulsing with this information which you are receiving from me. But the big point about this discussion is that it's not just biological. So this thing that we are learning about our brains is that it is not just all about nature. It is not only about the genes and these things that you inherit from your parents. You inherit, your brain structure is an inheritance from your parents.
A lot.
It is, sorry? Somebody saying something? No? Okay. It is also about nature. Your brain isn't a freestanding organ. It depends on the environment in which your brain functions. So our physical bodies are really in a relationship with our wider environments, which is what we are coming to understand. So this old debate, which we would have been very familiar with when we started our studies in education about nature versus nurture, really we've long gone past that particular debate. And we are now in this wonderful space of what we call epigenetics. And we are now learning to learn about epigenetics, because epigenetics is about how the genes which come to produce this particular brain that you have and our environments are in this constant interaction. So early in development, genes establish, and this is the biology, the blueprint for the basic structure of the brain, its architecture. But our genes are sensitive to chemical interactions which regulate how those genes operate, and those chemical interactions arise out of our social contexts. So when we have negative reactions, we set off these chemical interactions which fire our neurons in very particular kinds of ways. When we have pleasant reactions, we have very different physiological responses which arise. And so we have to be very conscious of how these environments, how adversity and stimulus in a good way work in our lives. So brain development is not simply or only the result of increased size or a larger number of connections. It is the pruning, the reorganization and strengthening of specific neural connections in response to experiences. Therefore, over time, both nature and nurture are integrated processes that together guide neural development. So when children enter the process of education, we have to be very aware of these positive and negative influences within their early environments, because these precipitate, these cause, these stimulate epigenetic changes which impact the development of their brain. So this is where executive functioning is really crucial for all of us to understand, because in that process of executive functioning, we have to be conscious of how bad experiences are responsible for holding children back. Shouting at a child, for example, in a very harsh way, precipitates these negative experiences. Telling a child that you are not worthy, that you are not valuable, that you have no value, are all experiences that impact on a child and on that child's ability to learn. So it's really important to be aware of how we are treating children and the ways in which we come to mediate this process of learning for them. Now, I'm not saying that negative experiences are only bad. Children do need negative experiences, but we have to bring those negative experiences to them in ways which don't injure, harm, or disturb, impair their capacity to learn. And here's now, coming out of this brain and behavior stuff, really important innovations which we are now needing to be very aware of. If I leave anything with you, colleagues, it is this story about understanding the innovative capacity which just this knowledge of how our brains work provides us with the opportunity to be able to innovate in important kinds of ways. And my warning is to say that our general approaches to classroom education do not sufficiently take into account these individual differences, which and the ways in which our children's brains work as epigenetic outcomes, and we treat them all alike. So we need innovative solutions, and we need to go beyond thinking about the normal, individualized, ideal child. We need to think about our classrooms as being filled with heterogeneity. The children in front of us are all different in powerful and wonderful kinds of ways. So one-size-fits-all rote learning pedagogies are dangerous in the sense that they prevent us from activating the possibilities for us to be able to teach children to the individual differences and distinctiveness which they bring to the classroom. Now, I want to share just very briefly with you 2 examples of modern approaches to individualized learning. The first one is teaching at the right level, and the second one is about multilingualism. So the first one comes out of the work of the Abdul Latif Jamil Poverty Action Lab. So this Action Lab is essentially based at the MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, but is now all over the world. So what this Action Lab has developed is this approach which they call teaching at the right level. And they've done it really powerfully in reading, learning children to read, and mathematics. It begins with a simple assessment of each learner. And the innovation here is that it groups children based on their learning level rather than by their age or grade. Now, this is really quite a disruption to the way in which we normally organize our teaching experiences. But what it allows, and of course there are challenges, having children of different ages in a single group. What it allows is for us to develop clear learning goals for each group according to what their needs are, and to develop pedagogies which combine a variety of engaging activities to stimulate the very different types of learning that are required, for these different learning levels in which children find themselves. And in this process, assessment is really crucial. So you're assessing here not to simply establish where a child is in relation to a standard. You are assessing to evaluate where a child is in a process. And it's a very different approach to begin to model. So there are two models, with the first being learning camps throughout the year. This is what the Action Lab does, lasting 30 to 50 instructional days each, that are dependent on the needs identified at the beginning of the program. In between the bursts of teaching at the right level instruction, learners return to their regular grade classes. And so, yes, there they go back to the age groups and friendship circles with which they are familiar. In the second group, the groups are taught together for 1 or 2 hours every day to focus on their basic skills. As I say, assessment is really crucial here. And so we've got programs like this, learning at the right level all over the world. Reached over 60 million learners in India. So it's a form of personalized learning, which even the World Bank has said has made differences to the way in which children are learning in many parts of the world. Multilingual classrooms are the second approach which I wish to speak about here. The key term to leave with you here is about funds of knowledge. The use of monolingual language in education effectively excludes second language speakers from full participation in the education and contributes to low achievement, reduced confidence, interest, and motivation. And this arises in very, very many countries that are multicultural, that have refugee communities, that have communities of indigenous populations, where languages are spoken which aren't the preferred and official languages of the country, and so what we are making an argument here for is that what these monolingual practices do is ignore the language resources, the knowledge resources which learners from second language or third languages bring into the classroom experiences. And as I've said here, children enter schools with proficiency in at least one home language. They have their own language repertoires. which have their own cultural resource repertoires, which are what colleagues call funds of knowledge. These children, in their second language, know things. They know things which other children do not know. So building on these funds of knowledge has been identified as a key goal for good educational practice. It's a pedagogy that will seeks to address the linguistic diversities by validating students' first language and culture, and how those children experience learning in multicultural kinds of concepts. So there's lots of studies about this. A study done by Duarte in 2020 analyzed data from 29 learners aged 6 to 8 who spoke one of 8 languages. These learners were attending reception classes in Australia. And a tool used by these educators, and it looks like a very a simple innovation, but it's a very important innovation, is to develop word language maps in which we are facilitating children having their prominent concepts in their own languages included in a single learning chart, a poster, and having these languages in juxtaposition alongside of each other. A learner can see that when we're talking about photosynthesis in English, they can see what the Spanish word is alongside of it, and it brings into that kind of space a sense of both familiarity, but also proximity to the other. So you can build multimodal tasks out of learning maps. Writing bilingual presentations, and it's a really powerful means for navigating the needs of learners. So I come to conclude, colleagues, with a few points to leave with you. We must recognize that the reciprocal interaction between physiology and environment makes each child unique, with their own learning abilities and needs. This is this epigenetic story that I was talking about, where each child brings their unique personal neural history, their brains, to school, creating challenges for teachers who must personalize learning for each child. Critical is that children then learn at the level which is appropriate for their needs. We must also acknowledge that children will be better equipped to learn when they're accepted and feel accepted, when they feel at home and their differences are embraced. Education must begin to respond to this individuality through innovative pedagogy and the empowerment of teachers. So this requires that the broad education system and its stakeholders must make learning a public, social and collaborative effort that embraces knowledge gained both inside and outside of the classroom. So schools teachers will also need to, and there's 6 points here, understand our learners well, treat them with the respect they deserve and provide a safe environment for them, design classroom teaching that builds connections between their funds of knowledge and new information, connect them to real-world applications, provide them with a stimulation to take as much control of their learning as they can. And of course, and this is the whole thing about assessment, always giving them careful and appropriate feedback. So this is the last slide, colleagues, and I'm simply saying to us that difference, diversity is with us all the time. Even when our children speak one language, these children are different inside of the majority of the classrooms of the world. They're different because of how their brains work. And so this we are ignoring in traditional models of education. There's a lack of recognition of this fact, and it results in what I call social injustice. Innovative pedagogy, on the other hand, is now able to deliver personalized learning, and thus welcome and respond to all forms of difference and diversity and embrace the uniqueness of individuals. It is only through the development of new ways of teaching and learning that we can move towards inclusive education and closer to social justice. Thank you very much for listening to me, colleagues.
Thank you very much, Dr. Crain. And now we move on to the questions. If anyone in the audience wants to ask something, please raise your hand. Ahora vamos a seguir con las preguntas. Si alguien en el lado presencial quiere preguntar algo, levante la mano, por favor. Y en el lado virtual, las pueden poner en el chat o también levantar la mano.
No
Okay,
question.
Dr. Crain, we have a question in the chat. The question says, how long this new type of learning will take to implement it into the present of learning today?
So the best examples that we have here are of this learning at the right level, and so they have studies of how that particular model works. But I'm going to say here, colleagues, that we are still in the area here of not only experimentation, but it's an invitation to each of us here to enter that space. But critically, for our empirical ability to be able to speak authoritatively, and for me to be able to answer this question properly, to study and comment on what we are seeing. And we are not yet at that particular point. So I am not able to come to you and say to you that this innovation has a 10-year-long history here, and that I can point to particular studies which demonstrate what the weaknesses and the strengths of this innovation might be. But we need it. So I'm inviting us to join this community of experimentation, and for us to enter into communities of practice around all of this, where we can talk with each other across the world, as I am talking to you now, to hear what you are doing, for you to see what is being done, and particularly in parts of the world that you are not familiar with, and to say that we have an opportunity here to learn from each other, colleagues.
Thank you, Dr. Crain. ¿Alguna pregunta más en el lado virtual? Pueden levantar la mano o enviarla en el chat. Okay, Dr. Crain, looks like we don't have any more questions. Thank you again for your presentation and your assistance here in the Congress. Aplausos, por favor, chicos.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to this very strange compadre from another part of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.